Welcome back to On-Site Report. My name is Theodore Abbott, and this is episode 3. So we're talking about False Creek South today, the south end of False Creek. You might remember we talked about the north end of False Creek in last episode. So why this is a significant place and why we're focusing on it is because the city livable movement, which we've been focusing on, and I'm sure you've heard us talk about, was sort of emanated from False Creek South. This was, as you'll hear our guest in today's episode talk about, this was a third and a third and a third, made up of a third high income, a third middle income, a third low income. This was a place that was supposed to be walkable. It was supposed to be, cars were sort of occluded and hidden. Parking was underground. And it was a place that represented the, as Colleen says, the sensibilities of the time. And the city livable movement was reflected here in a really important way. And despite Vancouver's urbanization sort of eroding a lot of the valuable or valued neighborhoods in Vancouver, False Creek South has up until now managed to maintain itself in a really unique way. And it's, of course, a big contrast to across the water, False Creek North, which is, luxury towers, very little below market housing, if any. For our listeners who might not know, when we're referring to False Creek South, we are referring to an area of Vancouver that stretches basically from Granville Island until Science World. And then, of course, there also is the Olympic Village. And that's not really, the Olympic Village was a development that happened after for the 2010 Olympics. And it was originally supposed to reflect the city livable movement. It was supposed to reflect the mixed tenure use that exists in False Creek South proper, with all these condos. A lot of it was supposed to be below market, affordable social housing, but that never happened. There are like affordable units, quote unquote, in that area, but it's all mostly luxury at market housing. So the original team, which stands for the Electors Action Movement, came about in the late 60s. And the team were champions of the city livable movement. They thought that the city should be a place that represented, human values and at scale human urbanism. And they didn't think that it should be a place where freeways were built and stuff. And a big part of team's sort of momentum was preventing a freeway from getting built that would have cut through a lot of East Van and Strathcona and the downtown East Side and Chinatown. But that was in the early 70s that team's big legacy, the original team's big legacy was the development of False Creek South. And that's why Colleen's father, Walter Hardwick, he has his name, Walter Hardwick Avenue, on a street in the Olympic Village. But Colleen was very young then. And then Colleen revived team in 2021. And now it's called Team for a Livable Vancouver. And now it's a prominent civic political party, which I should acknowledge that I do work for. Just to be transparent, I actually work for Team during the day. But the concept for this episode came about before I started working for Team. And then they offered me a job, which was cool. So just full transparency there. Our guest today is Colleen Hardwick. And Colleen is an urban geographer, an entrepreneur, a politician, formerly city councillor, and really just Colleen is someone with an incredible encyclopedic knowledge of Vancouver's history and Vancouver's civic history. If you want to know how the city works, she's the person to talk to. And she also comes from this long line of prominent Vancouver politicians and thought leaders. And so, she's just she's a really important figure, I think, in the way that the city's come together, and also a really important critic of the way that it's currently being run. So I was really, I think we were both pretty stoked that we got to sit down and chat with her. So with that being said, here's my conversation with Colleen Hardwick. Colleen, welcome to the show, and thanks for sitting down to talk with me today.
My complete pleasure.
I appreciate it. One of the things that we're trying to do with this, as I was just describing with this project, is mapping the city and sort of creating a vivid portrait of Vancouver's recent urbanization and the way that it's changed and how that change is unique to other cities and how it's similar. Obviously, False Creek as a site, both north and south, is kind of a linchpin in terms of studying Vancouver's urbanization. And, our listeners will be familiar with False Creek North from episode 2. And now we're here to talk about somewhat False Creek South and that area, why it's relevant, its history, and also then where it's going. And so with that being said, what do you think? I mean, the history of False Creek South, where does it begin? We've talked a lot about the Expo era, but of course, False Creek South as we know it began, the False Creek South that's famous and has hundreds of thousands of academic articles written about it, was born out of the original team era, the Team 1.0 era. And so to take us through that sort of the late 60s, the early 70s, what were the events that set in motion the coming together of False Creek South as we know it today?
Well, coming off of the post-war years through the 50s and into the 60s, we saw a real movement of urbanization and suburbanization, the movement out of the downtown core and into the suburbs. And with that, so much was reliant on the automobile culture. So that was having a huge effect. And going into areas that had previously been derelict, like Strathcona was seen as that way. The whole notion that it was okay to put a freeway through that would have knocked out Chinatown and Strathcona was acceptable to those that thought that was a good form of urban development. False Creek was in a unique position. Again, the city of Vancouver geographically was based on a peninsula. And so on the north side of that, of course, it started with Hastings Mill and Granville. And then around on the False Creek side had been sort of the secondary industrial area. So that's where all the log booms were and the cooperage and the cement factory. And by the 60s, it had hit its best by date. And it was really becoming what was referred to as a zone of discard at the time. And there were those that argued that it should be retained in an industrial use, but it was pretty clear in looking at where the shift was happening with the decline of our natural resource extraction industries and moving out of the city, which was feeling more and more growth pressure. So again, the idea was originally you had a central business district and then you had the industrial ring around that. Well, if you moved the industrial ring off and it went elsewhere, then that created the opportunity for more residential development. But the question became, well, what kind of residential development? And there was a very strong movement coming out of the late 60s at the same time that we saw things like the civil rights movement and the coming off the back of the Vietnam War. Very strong sense that we needed to do the socially right thing in the way. You don't go in and just, knock down all the poor people's houses and put up rich people's houses, for example. We want to build something that balances all of those values. And so False Creek, in its conception, was conceived to be a third, and a third in balance between high, medium, and low-income families, but all living in an environment that balanced the housing type with mobility, the transportation matrix, community amenities, including parks and access to the waterfront, and the commercial activity, because people need to know where they're going to work, where do we have access to work, and where do we shop. But the key thing was, and why False Creek really was the poster child for the livable city movement, was because it was illustrative of how they managed that balance. Mm-hmm. And so it very much came out of the sensibility of the time. We were still facing nuclear annihilation as a threat at that time before we started turning our attention to climate change. So limits to growth. Writers like E.F. Schumacher, who wrote not only A Guide for the Perplexed, but Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered. Their value system was really embedded in what do we need to do to balance, to plan for the future. And that's really, I think, the biggest thing that's changed in Vancouver over the decades. But from the time when Team was there, and then when Ray Spaxman came in as director of planning, the emphasis was very much on that kind of balanced approach to forward thinking, and the concept of neighborliness, mm-hmm. which again socially didn't matter whether you were rich or poor. Your kids all walked out the same front door, went to the same schools, and had the same opportunity. So it was very much embedded in the underlying value system.
And so this was heavily influenced by Jane Jacobs and the City Livable movement. And the City Livable, if I'm correct, right, this was a departure from the city efficient, or the city as like an efficient, when Vancouver was still predominantly industry-based. It was an industrial city. It didn't seem like that radical of a thing. It doesn't seem like that radical of a thing now. But back then, the idea that the city should be like a nice place to live was sort of a progressive idea, right?
It was.
And I think folks might have, we might take that for granted now, because Vancouver has successfully become so, well, it did become livable, and we might be back.
It was, and like I say, False Creek was the poster child for the livable city movement globally.
Yeah.
And but again, if you go back and you track the series of events, this was something that I talked about in Patrick Condon's think tank down at UBC, Simon Robson Square recently, as we looked at the swing from different kinds of civic governance, from corporate to consultative to participatory. And after the war, it became very corporatist. And it was driven by captains of industry, mm-hmm. and very much boosterism and profiteering.
And this was MPA. This was the MPA, the era of Vancouver being run by, the first era of Vancouver being run by businessmen. And Team came along and broke that trend.
Yeah, well, yes, it did. And it was about a consultative model as opposed to the full participatory model, which was advocated previously with the ward system and had been the COPE party's key thing was the ward system. Team had advocated ultimately for a hybrid system, but it focused on representing people in communities and neighborhoods. And, again, the whole planning vision, though, was to create a livable city for residents and future generations. That changed over time, and it changed at the same time. I think that we can see that the principal drivers of the local economy used to be the natural resource extraction industries. The city exists because we were the terminus of the railway and the port to the Pacific, and we grew off the back of forestry, fisheries, mining. When I was growing up, McMillan Blodell was the biggest show in town. But fast forward to Expo 86, you talked about that in one of your earlier shows, we see, and the sale of the north side of False Creek to Li Ka-shing and Concord Pacific, that set the stage then for the shift from resources to real estate as the principal driver of the local economy. And that's what we've seen over the years. It really picked up pace in the 2000s, there were some major shifts around the time of the world financial crash in 2008. And I'd say the top of the gold rush, if you look at the numbers, was 2016 in terms of the financialization of real estate in the province of British Columbia.
And then I think Liberal government came in 2001. Provincial, that was Gordon Campbell.
Yeah.
2001, Gordon Campbell. And then that lasted till 2017 when Horgan took over.
I think, again, the notion was where do we need to go to get the money to grow the economy? And that, I sometimes think that government needs to shake its head and think, what's our job versus what's the job of the Board of Trade or the BIA? It's business's job, it's corporation's job to drive corporate growth. It's government's job to balance the interests in the ultimate best interests of its residents. And I think that in my examination of it over time has shown that there were certain individuals that have disproportionately been advantaged, and it's widened the gap between global wealth and the local economy. And to the extent I fear for your generation and my kids' and grandkids' ability to stay here.
Yeah.
So we have to take a bit of a shake of our heads and think about how do we get here and what are we going to do to turn it around. But again, looking at False Creek as a model, it did an exceptional job. They also did a good job down at Champlain Heights in building housing that was ground-oriented architecture, which is good for people's mental well-being as well, access to the green space. And I think the social composition, the third, a third, and a third I referred to, was really important if you talk to people that grew up there. There's changes that are going on now because there's a lot of people that have been aging in place, and I think some serious need for transition for seniors who don't need as large places, but they still want to stay in the same neighborhood, and to enable families. But I think there were also elements of the model that enabled it being built. You know that it was the federal, provincial, and the city worked together to get it funded. Mm-hmm. The city had the land, but they had to do the assembly because, there, as I mentioned earlier, there were a bunch of leases that had to be acquired and delayed.
And so in False Creek, still to this day, we have mixed use. So there's co-op housing, there's some social housing, which sometimes the definition of what social housing is a little foggy. And then there is seniors housing. There's designated housing for seniors, and then there's at market and below market. So there's various mixed use. And is that correct? Like, is that kind of the breakdown of what they have? But it's ultimately a third, and a third, both, and tenure as well as income. Yeah. And it's measured to income level. And one of the knock-on effects, I think David Lay described this, was after they made, I think he says a previously noxious neighborhood, a now desirable one, namely False Creek. Yeah. False Creek South. And what that did was it essentially helped to gentrify the Fairview Slopes neighborhood that's flanks just behind False Creek South, just south of it. And so how do you avoid that? How do you avoid that process? I mean, how can you, obviously you need participation from senior government to continue building like you would, like Team built in False Creek South, but how do you avoid the inevitable process of an unintended elitism, if you will?
Well, again, people need jobs and access to work. And it depends on where they live. I mean, now we can work remotely. That's changed the dynamic. But wherever the demand is going to be present. But we have to, I was hoping to be able to replicate. That was one of the things that I ran on, was being able to replicate that model and build more of that balance of a third, and a third housing in different parts of the city. And
so you just need more. I mean, you just can't have one area that's a third and a third and a third, because it'll inevitably...
No, but there's so much pressure there. I mean, the land is the meat and the predators are circling. You've got to know that. It's, every parking lot, gas station, church, you name it. They're all under
Park.
Yeah, park. Yes, they're all inventory, and that's a big issue. As long as we continue to put the upward pressure that we have, but we have to go back to first principles and think about what kind of city do we want to live in? Where are we trying to go? Are we trying to make another resort city that only wealthy people can afford to live in? And, the service workers that live on the periphery, and we continue to sell to offshore wealth because the whole machine that we've developed in our local economy is based on it, or it has been based on it, for the last 15 years. And I've argued before that in the last 15 years, going back to 2008, 2009, when the city changed its business and financial model to regularize developer contributions as a revenue stream in the capital budget, they set up a model that basically sells zoning to generate revenue to fund the new definition of capital projects, which is not just infrastructure anymore. It's council priorities defined as climate change, social issues, economic development, or so-called affordable housing. So I get into this. I know I'm getting into the weeds a little bit on this, but it is this is a business model that is preventing us coming up with housing solutions, but we've become so dependent on it. It's going to take a lot to wean from. And I don't think the market wants to do that.
Just to clarify for our listeners, because I want to maybe stick a pin in that, the creation of the business model. I mean, because what Colleen is describing here, folks, is something that we need to delve deeper into, and with more detail and a little bit more focus. But this was in the Vision era. This was 2009, and this was when Vancouver essentially turned zoning and property into a business model. And this was, I think, the city's total capital budget was made up of 0% developer contributions.
Yeah, the capital budgets were always funded by debt, by debenture borrowing. The city would do a plebiscite and say to the electorate, do you approve us borrowing $40 million to replace the Cambie Bridge when Mike Harcourt was mayor? You had a plebiscite to determine, because you borrow millions of dollars.
And what is a plebiscite?
Plebiscite is like a referendum. It's when it's voting. The people vote. Do we want to borrow this money because we're going to have to pay it off with interest out of the operating side of our budget, which is our property taxes, over long amortization periods, up to 40 years at that time. So people, if it's like, I'm going to pay more in income tax or property tax, I want to have a say. Mm-hmm. And so that's what a plebiscite's all about. And that was always the way that we would get money to build or do infrastructure projects. But when they started, as you know from Larry Beasley's book, and going back to Concord Pacific, the director of planning started negotiating CACs, or community amenity contributions, on a location-specific basis. But what they did in 2008, 2009 is they came up with the business model that said, okay, we've got X number of blocks that we're going to plan and expect that X number of developers are going to come in and do this many land assemblies going up this many stories, and every time they want to do that, they're going to do a rezoning application, and with that comes $1 million or whatever the piece of the action is. And so that's when the business model that's when they could set targets and projections, because they had a business model behind it. And so we expect that we're going to get this many rezonings through, and we're going to generate this much revenue so we can spend it on this other stuff that isn't just infrastructure. So that's, I know people start to go a bit foggy when I start talking about the business model, but it really does boil down to that. Because the minute you incentivize rezoning, as it's incentive your staff, so their success metrics then become, how many rezonings can I get approved? Mm-hmm. Not how can I work with the community to develop
It's sales.
project.
It's just like incentivizing
It's a business.
sales team.
It's a corporate model.
It's a corporate model,
and it's not designed on public service.
No,
public service is again, change is inevitable. We're going to grow. We're going to have more building and more people, but it's a question of how much, where, in what form, and in balance with mobility, community amenities, commercial activity. That's why we plan for communities, and that's why we work with people in the neighborhoods to do things in their best interest if we are in the public service.
And how much of the capital budget after this new business model was adopted?
Well,
was
and
made
the most
up
recent one was 46.3% of the capital budget was of two. Again, I'll look it up, but $1 billion, $2 billion, a lot of money. And so the city has become more and more dependent on promoting rezoning to generate revenue. But of course, now the province has gotten in on the action, and I won't mention any names on your radio show, but the same people that brought in this business model to the city with Vision Vancouver in 2009 then found themselves in Horgan's office in Victoria. And now the model is broadly being adopted now that the province has brought in legislation that removes the need of municipalities even to have public hearings to discuss whether they should have rezoning or not.
Yeah, it completely bills, and the bills that Colleen is referring to here are 44, 46, and 47. So we won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but go do your homework. Look up bills 44, 46, and 47 because they are atrocious and disastrous. But you mentioned the vultures surrounding the land, the vultures sort of circling the land, the predators circling the land. The land is the meat, as you said. And it seems that the vultures are circling False Creek South.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems like that this gem of the City Livable movement, this world famous example of a third and a third and a third of, well managed growth, is under threat. And
it's totally under threat.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, when I was on council, I worked with then Larry Beasley and with the late great Nathan Adelson on motions to try and push back. And again, we've been trying to get the leases renewed for forever.
And so most of that land, or all of it, is on lease.
That's correct. And so I had worked on developing the motion. I remember Nathan and I working until all hours to get the motion in. And then I got stonewalled by, again, I'm not going to go mentioning names, but other councillors who didn't, in my view, really understand what was going on. And eventually there was enough lobbying of other councillors to get some protections in place then, but they're short-lived because now ABC has a majority and the predators are circling.
And what do they, obviously, you could speculate and say their ultimate goal is to replace most of the social housing, co-op housing with luxury condominiums and infill.
Towers. And infill. The towers. All you have. I remember. Again, I'm a little dubious about mentioning names, but had a couple of high-profile lobbyists come in when Gil Kelly was still director of planning, looking at what their vision was. And again, it's how much can we stack in there? It's all about maximizing profit. The notion that we are thinking about what's good for people and how they live is just not material. It's all about profit. It's all about profit, and they, they're going to do everything that they can to get access to that land. Whether it's through First Nations, which has been happening in a significant way, because ultimately the land is the money, and the money is always oriented towards profitability. And the city, again, has become increasingly corporatist. We've seen so much empire building, and the size of the civil service itself is staggering. If you plot it out, and again, I've gotten the numbers and tried to get it out there so that people can see what's actually going on, but most people don't really pay attention to what's going on in municipal politics.
And what Colleen's referring to here, just for clarity, is the expansion and the mushrooming of non-elected positions at City Hall that are bureaucratic positions, a lot of them in the engineering department, in the last planning and
corporate services, communications, mayor's office. The number of exempt staff, meaning non-union staff, they're largely middle management, 6-figure salaries, has ballooned.
And these jobs, these people are making good money, right? I mean, these I think all of these positions are over $100,000 a year. And the same thing, which I don't think people realize, is that the same thing is happening at the provincial level. In
the
British
largest
Columbia.
growth sector in the economy is the public sector.
It's the public sector, and as you just heard Colleen say, this is empire building, and I think that that's a really great way of describing it, because these people are not accountable to a constituency. They're not elected officials. They're bureaucrats, and they hide behind a bureaucratic veil, and they're simply not accountable, and that's a huge issue. And this is an issue we're seeing in Vancouver at the civic level, and as I said, at the provincial level, and it reinforces the structure of government in such a way that it makes it, I think, far less democratic. And as you said, people might not be paying attention to civic politics, but also I don't think they're really paying attention to provincial politics, because this is a current trend that we've been seeing, and it's striking, right? It's
well, again, there's a direct correlation between the decline in local media and decline in voter turnout. People are not informed and educated. Frankly, most people don't know what one level of government does from the other.
Yeah.
So when I talk about downloading from the senior levels of government onto the municipal budget, they just look at me like, "What are you talking about?" But the truth of the matter is that I had the chief financial officer from the city produced a report in 2022 that showed something in the order of $363 million worth of downloading from senior levels of government on both the operating and capital sides of the city's budget during our 4-year term. And no one seems to be willing to talk about this, and no one pushes back and said, "Oh, that's not the city's responsibility." What is? Those roads and sewers and pools and parks and the things. The city is ultimately responsible for the dirt. It's that ground level stuff, and it's being, frankly, not taken care of because it's not a priority. So if you look at what the priorities are, you'll find that it comes into the 4 council priority areas as they describe them, which are climate change, social issues, economic development, and so-called affordable housing. So it's part of the problem is with the more you take on, the more revenue streams you need. So we're constantly hearing from staff and council, "Oh, well, we're looking for new revenue streams," forgetting about the fact, of course, that the money's got to come from somewhere, and people are already having a hard enough time affording living here, unless it's the global elite that are coming in and parking their money.
And what would you say to the people who they say, "Oh, social housing isn't getting built, so the alternative shouldn't be no housing. I mean, let them build, let them densify, because, we're not going to get that social housing or that low income housing or that co-op housing anyways. So we might as well have development."
No. Again, if you model it out, you see you end up with more people couch surfing and on the street.
Yeah.
A rising tide lifts all boats. When you inflate land values exponentially, which is what has occurred here, particularly, I looked at the 2010 to 2020 period alone, the land and the zoned area above it went from 188 to 480 billion in 9 years. That's 2.5x. You need a reasonable level of inflation. I mean, we talk about having reasonable levels of inflation about our grocery bills or our gas bills, or if it's a 2.5%, 3%, we can live with it. But here we're talking about galloping inflation is double digit. This is like galloping on steroids.
Yeah.
And it has happened, again, largely because of the rampant rezoning, which has led to, again, a rising tide across the city. Every time you rezone a piece of property, you inflate its value by definition, right? Mm-hmm. So do it hundreds of times over and build a business model. And guess what? You've increased land values to the point where it doesn't matter what you build on them. Now, the cost of building, of course, between labor and materials has skyrocketed. Forget about things like insurance and all the other costs of doing business when you lay it out in a pro forma. And it's an unsustainable model, but those who stand to profit are going to perpetuate it.
And so, what do we stand to learn from False Creek South? And what's the future of that area? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, people need to wake up and smell the coffee. I do think it starts with, what are we doing here? Are we promoting growth for profit? Although if you actually look at the numbers, our population growth has been going at about 1% per annum. And we've seen declines as well. And the building is in excess, although it's been hell for me trying to get real numbers. Thank God that people like Brian Palmquist have gone after them, because certainly I was never even able to get the data that I needed out of the city. But the building is in excess of population growth, and ultimately we should be asking ourselves, okay, population growth, what jobs, what industries, where are they going to work? What are they going to work? Are they going to have kids? Are they going to go to school? We have to think about, these are complex questions that we have to think about in balance. But when you're promoting growth for profit, you're just thinking about profit. You're not thinking about balance. And so if there's a lesson that we can learn from False Creek, is it is about balance and sustainability, not about profit. And this notion that promoting profit is going to trickle down and make life better for, poor people. I got a bridge to sell you, right? We've heard this before. It's not going to happen. So what we should be aiming at is achieving balance or equilibrium. And in our approach to our economy, looking at how we can be diversifying our economy and building off of local success stories. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we've become a tertiary office for American multinationals, and they just come here because it's cheaper because of the dollar or whatever tax credits they can get. And that goes for the movie business and the technology industries. Instead of ultimately what we ought to be doing, which recovering economies will do, which is really promoting innovation and entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And, we were at a meeting, a Broadway plan meeting about a month or so ago. And I think someone said, it's taken us just about 30 years to get into this mess, and it's going to take another 30 years to get out of it. And so in this interregnum, in this sort of area, in this time of transition, a lot of people have been leaving.
Yeah.
A lot of people in my generation and in Charlie and I's generation have been going elsewhere, and there's been this huge exodus. And I think that the city, is becoming a bit of a shell, and it's losing some dimensions of its urban identity that make it sort of make it livable, or make it a rich place with a rich identity. And so while we try to dig ourselves out of this rut, I think people will keep leaving, because I think they'll look to other places in the province or other places in Canada, inevitably. And I mean, I know myself, I think all the time, like it almost seems like a fringe thing to do now to stay, to try to tough it out. Like it seems like we're almost in a bit of a minority, Charlie and I, for staying. Because so many people in our generation have left. I think that a city is nothing without its neighborhoods. You know, a city sort of ceases to be a city when it doesn't have those communities and those areas and those neighborhoods that make it, you know, a distinct place. And I'll quote Patrick Condon, who wrote an article recently, or this was back in the Kennedy Stewart era, and he said the city faces an existential crisis, and it is housing. Our service workers, many of whom are our sons and daughters, can no longer afford to live here. A city that excludes the very people it depends on is not worthy of the name. And end quote. And I kind of think about, at what point does a city cease to be a city? As we think about what defines a city, when does it cease to be a place where, you know, as you said, it's sort of just becoming a kind of a carnival, a place to park money, a playground for the rich or what have you. And I think Vancouver is really well on its way to figuring out the answer to that question. I mean, we're certainly going the direction of, you know, an existential shift in what the city actually is. Is it just this revolving door of money? Is it one big cactus club kind of thing? I mean,
naming rights countdown on Kit's pool.
Yeah, there we go. Naming rights. You know, if you haven't been listening to the news, Mayor Ken Sim is talking about selling naming rights to parks, to corporations. So giving corporations the ability to have their name put on a park. So that's, I mean, yeah, when you start renaming things in the city after corporations,
it's revenue streams. I mean, again, what needed to happen in 2022 was to go back and do a baseline review back to 2008 to see, how did they double the budget? Where did the money come from? Where did the money go? And my examination of that showed early on where the city had, you know, been spending the money. If you look at the headcount in particularly, I looked at, you know, where did the money come from? I've talked about it on the capital budget side. The other side, it's tax increases and other pay-as-you-go kind of charges. But on the capital budget side, it just went through the roof. And 85% of that cost is in headcount increase. And if you look at what departments were the recipients of this largesse? Well, you see, they added 243 new people in the planning department. You know, so I just started looking at where's the headcount increases and what are they doing? You know, we created all these new departments, again, things that are outside the scope of municipal responsibility. And then the city started giving a lot of money away. It decided that it should, if you look at the amount of grants that the city went from, again, a steady state to, it's almost as if the city then started to try to become an economic generator itself, tried to become entrepreneurial, in creating organizations like they did with the Vancouver Economic Commission, which I agree has been was inappropriate. The city should be doing things like to make it easy for, you know, I worked in the movie business, you know, we make it easy for you to shoot on the ground. It's the logistical stuff. We need parking permits. We need police. We need the logistical stuff. But it's not our job to be going out and traveling around globally and trying to attract business to Vancouver.
I mean, that's the neoliberal city. In urban studies talk, they call it the competitive city. You know, the city that needs to market itself.
That's not your job. That's the Board of Trades. That's the business. That's the private sector's job. You're the public sector. That's not your job. And besides, if I'm in the film industry and I go to Cannes or I go to the American film market and I say, come on, shoot in Vancouver, they're going to shoot somewhere else in British Columbia or out in Langley or something because the tax credits are better. So it's again, I think it's an inappropriate. There are things that we can be doing from an economic standpoint, but it's not our job to be the Board of Trade. That's their job.
Well, I totally agree. And I think I completely agree, but I think that people might counter and say, well, cities have to be competitive now. They have to market themselves because the money's dried up from senior government. And, there's just no money coming down if you look at Vancouver's co-op housing, it was all built in collaboration with the feds. And when that money dried up, the co-op housing dried up too.
The federal government is even more egregious in its headcount increases and its expansion into areas that are really outside of its responsibility. I'm, not a fan of what I've been watching happening in Ottawa for the last decade. But putting that aside, we can focus on the city and what is the city's set of responsibilities. And what I was getting at there is we needed to go back, do a baseline review, analyze where did the money come from, where did the money go, and then retrace our steps. Do we really need all of these positions? Just go on LinkedIn and look at all the stuff. I mean, it's amazing, the volume. If you're looking for work in this day and age, you look in the public sector.
You've described it to me before, but this decline of consultation or the sort of symbolic token consultation where they do it, but they don't take to heart what they get back, the data that they collect.
Well, paradoxically, the internet has changed that, because once upon a time we didn't have that, and people were there in person. I remember going as a kid on down to City Hall when back when they were fighting the freeways, and there were a lot of people filled the gallery. You can't even go into the gallery now. There were events in neighborhoods where people came together. But and again, I was part of this and watching it come down. Once we started to bring it all online, then they just gather feedback and it goes into a black box. Mm-hmm. And so there's no bidirectional communication or collaboration. It's very much they going through the motions, ticking the boxes. Once upon a time, again, they used to send out surveys to the neighborhood, and you would have a code and complete a survey. Again, they were concerned about hearing from people within specific boundaries. You used to have to notify people within a 2-block radius of a rezoning or development permit application. There were processes around all of this. But it's all basically gone up in smoke, because the philosophy now is damn the torpedoes. We don't need to bother with people in the neighborhoods. We're not even going to have public hearings anymore. The developers, it's a feeding frenzy. They can do whatever they want.
So how can neighborhood residents assert a little bit more autonomy or assert themselves when dealing with the city?
Well, right now, I'll be honest, I don't think they can. I think the fix is in. And, I still hear people saying, well, we got to write more letters to, and send more emails and, maybe speak at council. And I'll go through the motions, but I just don't, again, having been in there, I don't have any faith that there is a process of adjudication where you're looking at pros or cons. I think the decisions are foregone conclusions. And if people do care, again, there's been a broad campaign to discourage people from being involved in their communities. They're derided as NIMBYs. They're basically told to get out of the way. Mm-hmm. And so How are people, I mean, in a democratic system where people are so, in other parts of the world, we still do have local democracy where people are organized at the neighborhood level. And I think that's one of the key discussions that we've got to have here as a city over the next couple of years. Our system of governance is an at-large model that enables a centralized control. There is nobody representing the neighborhoods. They don't care about the neighborhoods. They don't. Yes, there was a ward system until 1936, the first 50 years of the city. That was abolished, although it still exists within the Vancouver Charter. After the Depression, and it was actually 35 that it was abolished, but that's at the same time that the NPA came together as the merger between the Conservatives and the Liberals at the time to keep the communist hordes out of the CCF, eventually the NDP, and that was really, again, you have to consider the time. They were coming off the back of a depression and then into the Second World War and then recovering from the Second World War. So you have to put it in the context of the time to understand why it was that way. But it turned around, and that is the one thing that gives me hope, tying this all back to the neighborhoods. People did believe it was important to be involved in their community and that we would have power to the people, and they did start to self-organize. And I'm hoping that the people will rise up and self-organize and realize what's going on. The Broadway plan is a travesty. It was inevitable because of the Broadway subway, which again, the fix was in. If you track it all back, I would have advocated for a reboot of our surface rail streetcar system, which the city was built on in the first place, which would have enabled a more distributed model of medium density across the fabric of the whole city. Instead of the thing with the subway is you then concentrate high-rise towers around the subway stops, right? That's the business model. But you make more money building towers than you do, walk-ups. And it's ultimately the business model that's driving that. But if people want to live in a livable city, they care about their neighborhoods, they're willing to stay, because everybody I hear is always talking about leaving town. But where do we go? It's bad everywhere. But it's depressing, and it's depressing for people that were born and raised here in all generations. My kids, now my grandchildren just starting kindergarten. It's like, are we really going to stay here? Do we see a future here?
That's the crux, is that like we were saying the other day, how much damage can these guys do? And
they can do a lot of damage. They're doing a lot of damage.
Yeah.
And again, it's stupidity. If they had done their jobs, I mean, they said, "Oh, I'm an accountant. I know all about finance." I didn't have seemingly the first clue about how the city's finances work, from what I understand. And as I described, what really needed to be done was a analysis of where we were sitting relative to where we were when Gregor Robertson and Vision got in, and other key individuals changed the model that got us to where we are today. Now, we can't go back there and undo the damage that's been done, but we can course correct. Mm-hmm. But we have to think about what are we trying to do here in the first place? Are we trying to promote growth for profit?
Yeah.
In our corporate model, or are we trying to manage growth in the best interests of future generations? And, that's what the livable city is about. That's what False Creek was about. And, that's what I'm about looking forward. But I just want to be clear in all that change is the only constant, and we need to plan for the future. And that does not mean no growth, no building, no housing. That's absolute nonsense. We can make choices about how to do the right thing. And that's where I really wish that we were heading in that direction.
Okay, so big shout out to Colleen, and a big thank you to her for coming on the show again. A lot of big words. We learned some new words, and big concepts. Debenture. No, but these are important aspects of how Vancouver's been shaped over the last several decades, and things like the financialization of real estate in the province, the rule of the liberal, the provincial liberals, and Gordon Campbell to Christy Clark. Colleen was careful about not mentioning names there, although I wish she had. But a third and a third and a third. High income, middle income, low income, human scale urbanism, people falling off the housing ladder. We covered a lot of ground, but all very salient. And she also talked about how Vancouver's turned rezoning into a business model, a corporate business plan, and nothing. Almost no stone left unturned there. And I almost feel like we need another episode with Colleen, just another conversation to dig into some of that stuff a little further. But we are going to continue our conversation and continue to map Vancouver in the way that we have been. We might talk with a resident from False Creek South and continue the discussion of that area. As you know, and as you've learned, it's an important part of the city, and a part of the city that's facing a huge shift and a huge change going into the future. And, like I read that, I quoted Patrick Condon during our conversation, and Vancouver, as he said, is facing an existential crisis. And I don't think this is anything to be taken lightly. I mean, we're truly at a reckoning here. And I think, this series and this project is going to be something that takes a hard look at that and tries to tell some of the stories of how this is playing out in real time, and not only map the city, but map the people of it. And I mean, this is just, it's an interesting time to be paying attention to urbanization and also just civic politics more generally. So we might do some specific episodes just on, City Hall, the ABC Council, kind of pick that apart. But let us know if you have any suggestions for people to come on the show, any guest recommendations.
Hello, this is producer Charlie. Just chiming in to say you can send us an email at onsitereportpod@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at onsitereportpod, and check out our Patreon, patreon.com/onsitereport.
Thanks for listening to On Site Report. We'll catch you soon.
Let's do the numbers.